We are resuming our study of the Kena Upanishad and Sri Aurobindo's commentary of it after a gap of 4 months. And so it will be worthwhile to recapitulate, summarizing what has been covered in the text. The Kena Upanishad is in 4 parts. In the first part, it begins with asking 4 questions. The questions lead us from our present human experience, sensory, mental, to the source which makes possible this experience. What makes it that the mind is able to reach where it wants to go? When we think, what in our mind leads the thinking process itself? Now these are questions which go very deep. There is recent experimentation done to explore the level of intelligence in animals, in birds, and in human babies, to see where exactly the intelligence originates. How do you know what you know, and how do you know that you know it? You have a puzzle. Where do you begin? Already something within you leads in the direction of exploration. In the exploration itself, as you get closer to your solution, you know you're getting closer to the solution. Meaning something in you knows the direction and knows the closeness of the solution. Meaning it even knows the solution, at least in some essential form. And when you reach the solution, you know that you have reached it. What in your mind recognizes this as solution and then knows you can stop? So what you're seeing is an operation of mind which goes to its mark. But who makes it go to its mark? Who leads it secretly? This is the first question. We find in animals, for example, a complex operation of the same intelligence, where the formal nature of the mind is not yet developed. Animals can do complex conclusions based on nothing at all. No prior experience, no genetic inheritance, no external indication, and yet they know where they have to go. The classic example is of the birds being able to go great distances in order to nest and then come back, or fish that travel to the ocean, give birth, come back, and the children come back. The parents have died. How do they know? And we say instinct, but the word instinct is only covering our ignorance. We don't really know what is the mechanism of that instinct. And when you challenge the animals with things they have never done before, there is no instinct which is inherited, and yet it knows how to work itself around. And the same we find with human babies. They have complex recognition of the sense of good and bad. We can show that long before a child has had any programming through human contact, from the point it is able to observe, not even speak, you can show examples of activities with puppets, and the child will innately prefer the puppet which played the good role, not the puppet which played the bad role. So something inside the child already has recognition of this is good. But what is good? It's not a moral definition. It's an innate recognition in consciousness of what's true, what's right, what's closer to the divine. And so something within us, well behind the operations of the surface mind, already knows and leads the mind process. What is that? By whom missioned falls the mind shot to its mark? And in the same way, the other 3 questions. How is it? By whom yoked moves the first life breath forward on its paths? The life itself, the life energy, is led by something which is life of our life, just as that was mind of our mind. And so, by whom impelled is this word that men speak? And there is a speech of our speech, which is not spoken word, language, or sound, but something more essential as a power of expression, long before it takes forms of mind or physical sounds. And fourth, what God set eye and ear to their workings. The whole principle of perception. What is the essential perception, the sight of our sight and hearing of our hearing? Now these questions are so profound. They begin with something so common that we have stopped questioning. We assume that our mind can find an answer. How do we know even that question has an answer? Could there not be questions which don't have answers? And yet instinctively we know, because the deeper knowing knows far more. So in starting with something so simple and presumed in our life, it takes the whole experience to that which is beyond. And what we discover is there is a hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, life of our life, sight of our sight, a whole domain of a greater mind, greater life, greater sense, greater power of creation and expression, to which our sight, hearing, speech, they cannot reach. And that which is unexpressed, and so the verse goes, that which is unexpressed by the word, and that by which the word is expressed. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought. Which sees not with the eye, but which sees by the eyes seeing. That which hears not with the ear, by which the ear's hearing is heard. It's also the life breath by which this life exists. And so a whole new domain of reality is opened to us by this exploration. Now remember, this is not merely an exercise of speculative or philosophical exploration. It is meant to be an inward turn of introspection. The student of the Kena Upanishad is led by the Rishi to turn his awareness inward and observe inside him subjectively from where this knowledge comes which leads my mind's process. What within me is actually perceiving when I look at something. I look at a flower and I say it's beautiful. But what is the thing within which recognizes it as flower and recognizes its beauty, gives to it its color and its value? And this introspective process disengages from the surface reality and opens you to the inner reality. And the series of verses, all belonging to only the first part of the Kena, are leading us to this poise of an inner and higher consciousness. Now at this point, the second part shows you that whatever you have attained to is not enough. It says, if you think that you know it well, meaning you must have gone to somewhere now in your introspection that you think, now I'm able to experience this deeper and higher reality. And then it says, if you think you know it well, then little do you know the form of the Brahman. And so what is it? That of it which is you, that of it which is in the gods, this you have to think out. And when you do this, then you will begin to know it. So it points now to a next level of introspection. Again, an inward psychological, psycho-spiritual process. Having got to a poise which perhaps belongs to the inner antahkarana, inner being, or some higher or deeper poise of consciousness, perception, it says, to know the Brahman, which is the actual source of this, you have to know that of it which is you. Meaning, within us there is a part which is one with the Brahman. And externally at the same time, in nature, that of it which is in the gods, in the deeper processes of nature, again behind the scenes. If we have been successfully able to go inward in our subjective exploration, also in our external perception, we are able to see deeper. What in the tree makes for the tree's impulse to grow? What in the tree gives it the knowledge of how it must grow? What in the tree is giving it the forms of its expression? And when we begin to perceive this, we realize there is a deeper life. There is a deeper sense. Although the tree does not have eyes and ears to hear or see, it still is able to move around in the world. A creeper grows towards a nearby stick and then starts climbing it. A seed which is placed inside in the darkness of the earth, and it can be placed in any direction, it knows which is up. It knows how to get to the sun. And when it is cut off, its leaves are cut, it knows how to regrow and open to the sun. Where is that coming from? And in this way you begin to perceive all the processes of nature, and you discover behind those processes what is described as gods. Now, English translation is always a big problem. The correct word in Sanskrit is Deva, which means literally light or light being. The root is Div, which is the illumination, being of light. We recognize in nature powers of light. And what is light? The power of consciousness, revealing and activating itself, exerting itself. We discover behind nature's processes these powers of consciousness working in a complex organization, complex hierarchy. In the theosophical system, which has a particular leaning towards the occult exploration of this reality, they describe these elemental beings and their higher beings in a whole hierarchy of beings who supervise and work in nature. At the lowest, these beings may be elemental beings who operate simply on some narrow, small process. At the highest, they operate over processes. But the highest gods are those which have a universal action. And it is towards these that the Kena is pointing us, being essentially a text close to the Vedic. What are these large cosmic powers which make for the whole working of universal nature? And all of these introspections will take us to the third part, where actually the gods are named. But here, next verse says in the second part, where we are now exploring this deeper exploration within us and in nature, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. So in the turn inwards where you say, what of me is Brahman? What of the gods is Brahman? In this introspective process, I don't really know, but I know that it's not unknown. There is a gap, like a veil, in which my current awareness is unable to actually reach it. And yet its presence flows out, reflects, reveals in my consciousness. So I know it's not unknown to me. I know it's there. But it's not me, or it's not accessible to me as I am. But it's close enough that its light, its presence imprints deeply. And then comes the key. He by whom it is not thought out has the thought of it. He by whom it is thought out knows it not. Meaning your problem of not being able to reach it is because of your thought process. Our means of knowing anything, even in a subjective inward turn, is really a working of the mind's awareness. And the mind can only go so far. Why? Because the nature of mind's perception is reductionist. It needs to cut what it sees. And so when it sees something which can be cut, it can catch the piece and say, now I know. You go to the ocean. How will you know the ocean? By grabbing a piece of the water and studying it. How do you know the water which you have grabbed? By further breaking it into smaller pieces and studying it. And so the innate process of mind is to limit and measure, whereas that is unlimitable. It's not that it's made up of something infinite that can be broken into pieces. It cannot be broken into pieces. It cannot be limited. And such a thing, when the mind goes to grasp, what happens if the ocean is a solid piece of ice? Try to grasp the water, your hands will keep slipping. And yet you touch it, but you can't take it into your power of knowledge unless it gives itself to you. But then what you can still receive is a piece of it. So the problem is, when you try to think it out, you cannot. But if you do not try to think it out, then you have the thought of it. And the wording is interesting, because in not trying to think it out, but opening yourself to receive its imprint into you, you have the thought of it. Meaning, you know it still in terms of thought, in your mind awareness. But you know what it gives of itself to you, not what you grabbed, which you cannot. So there is here the suggestion, and this is what Sri Aurobindo has shown us in his commentary, that in so doing, since we can't claim the knowledge and experience of the Brahman, you can open yourself to receive it, and something of it then settles in you, in your mind, and awakes in the highest part of your mind a sense of closeness, a sense of familiarity, and even an experience of it. So there is this part of your deepest or highest, most essential or pure awareness in which you can now experience the Brahman. Again, there's this word used, ineffable, meaning you cannot give it form of expression. And yet, you can experience it. You cannot know it, and yet you can experience it. And so there is this refined, fine limit of the mind where we begin to know. And then it says, it is unknown to the discernment of those who discern of it. By those who seek not to discern of it, it is discerned. By not trying, your very attempt to try is limiting. So rather you give yourself. And then when it is known by perception that reflects it, that's the poise you have, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. By the self one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. And so the whole internal process of the seeking, within us, the force that leads to it, and the knowledge which awakes to the immortality, the poise of the permanence of the Satchidananda, that grows in us. Now all of this is taking place in the student of the Kena Upanishad, of the Kena, led by the Rishi himself, as the Guru, as the teacher, Sri Aurobindo in this case, who is leading us to the exploration of the teaching of the Kena in its deepest, most profound mystic secret. The question comes, having come to this stage where one begins to experience the presence of the Brahman, even as by reflection, even as the power of the self leading us to attain to it, and the knowledge of the immortality grows, what happens to the rest of your being? And the next verse of the second part says, if here one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. Meaning all this must take place while you are here in life, in world. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then great is the perdition. And it is when the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, they pass from this world and become immortal. So the idea is to be not only awakened to it while in the physical consciousness, but to be able to perceive that presence now in all kinds of becomings, in the whole cosmos, in every process, in every activity, in every form, in every force. We begin to now see and know that. Then you pass from this world and become immortal, meaning you live in the Satchidananda consciousness, not in this consciousness of ignorance. But all this is taking place in the physical world while embodied. Now, part 2 has taken the process begun in part 1, which was a mental introspection. In part 2 has taken it to a more fundamental base of knowledge. No more mental, but opening to a more intuitive sense, and the assertion that this must be achieved and realized here in life, subjectively within and objectively in all things. Part 3 now leads us through a parable, a symbolic story, elaborating what was done so far in our yogic process inwardly, giving to it a certain form of knowledge which is in the Vedic symbolism, through a story that the gods are the powers of evolution, the powers working in the cosmos to push forward the evolutionary process. Equally they work in the cosmos as also within us. And the first verse says that the eternal conquered for the gods, meaning always the gods working and their conquest is not their doing, but the doing of the eternal. And the eternal did it as always, but in the victory of the eternal, the gods grew to greatness. And so we are reminded that while we are seeing still the workings of the gods within us, around us, that working is originating in the original divine consciousness. These are only means and forms or special aspects through which that acts, and it is his victory. But in this case, in the story, the gods don't realize this, and they say it is our victory, our greatness. And so the eternal, knowing this, now prepares to teach them the next step in their evolution. And he appears before them in a manner that they cannot recognize, a presence which they cannot grasp. And then they wonder, what is this? And then successively, 3 of the gods go forward. First Agni, and he is unable to burn a blade of grass that the eternal places before him. Then Vayu, he is unable to seize the blade of grass which the eternal places before him. And finally Indra, who goes forward, and as he attempts to know this presence, the presence vanishes, and there is only an emptiness. At that point, Indra is seeking, but there is no form anymore. Before him appears the woman, Uma Haimavati. This is the daughter of the snowy summits, the form of the Divine Mother, and he asks her, who was this mighty presence? And the third part ends here. Part 4 begins with what she teaches. So the third part really is describing the whole evolutionary journey on a cosmic scale as well as our individual, where there is this constant forward movement, the struggle, the battle of the gods against the resistance of inertia and darkness. And at some point, there is a victory. And perhaps there are relapses and victories, but there are a series of victories. In this whole forward movement of evolution, the powers that are working in evolution, the gods themselves, are growing as they grow in victory. So in the very first verse, there is the idea that in the victory of the eternal, the gods grew to greatness. So you look at the universe, the powers put out by the divine in assisting evolution, these powers are themselves growing as the evolution grows. There's a very deep truth of this here, which in the Vedic framework is articulated thus. In us, in human beings, when we open ourselves to the divine powers, the gods, when they enter and awake and organize themselves in us, we grow because of that presence. But also they grow because they are fulfilled in form and in human evolution. So this idea that not only we grow as the emerging movement from bottom up, but from top down in the workings of the gods, they also grow as they fulfill themselves in the domains of form. In matter, when the form evolves, it is the victory of the gods, or rather the victory of the eternal through the gods. But in the process, the gods are growing, and their power now to grow is increased. And in the next step of evolution, they are able to do much more. And again they grow because of that, and next they can do more. So the whole evolutionary process becomes more and more rapid, intense, more free, more direct and effective. In one of Sri Aurobindo's commentaries on the next step in evolution, he actually uses this phrase, evolution evolves. You see, it's a very deep insight. In the very act of overcoming, a new power now has come into action. And as that power now is able to overcome the next challenge, a new power within that comes forward. And this is the nature of evolution. And this evolution takes place now. The whole rest of the parable is a symbolic representation. Here is the divine presence, unknowable, but sensed by the powers. Naturally, the powers now seek to engage with it, to know it. And what do you mean by knowing it? Obviously, to take it into their functioning, to engage with it in their characteristic power. And the first of them is Agni, who is the creator of forms. So in the evolution, the first attempt to realize the divine and express the divine is the movement of Agni creating forms. The material emergence of substance, of rigid, stable substance, of matter. And he can only go so far. When he fails, Vayu comes in. Matter having evolved as far as it can, life force must now awake and seek to realize God and express in his way of knowing. And so you have the emergence through material evolution of life forms. And as far as they can go, until life itself is unable to go further, and the third power must emerge, which is Indra, mind, which seeks also to know God and realize and manifest the divine possibilities as far as it can go. But when it attempts finally to seize, having developed the human mind in evolution, Indra has come into its own in us. He's self-aware, and now with the human mind, I wish to know the divine, and suddenly all forms vanish. There's only this emptiness of the ether. But in that ether, he meets the Divine Mother, who teaches him and leads him to the divine, to the Lord. So this whole third part is an extraordinary parable because of the multi-layered suggestion and knowledge that it captures. Now we see here the whole movement of evolution through material, life and mind stages, led by the challenge of the gods coming in the presence of the divine and seeking to know him. Meaning all of evolution, all of nature is really striving to know the divine and to express in her terms, in their characteristic power, what is the divine. Meaning all matter which you see, including all the elements and all the combinations of elements of molecules and rocks and everything that you see in the waters, in the air, in the mountains, in the planets and galaxies, all these are an attempt to give form to the divine reality in and as matter. Literally then we will declare the universe, the physical universe, is the body that the gods have created for the divine to inhabit. And then life comes into this and creates still more complex expressions, more close to the power of the divine consciousness. The material part being representative of the Sat, the life energy brings the Chit Shakti, the energy of the divine creative expression, and all the rest that comes forward. Still not complete, because that process continues. But it cannot cross beyond the threshold unless the third power of Indra emerges. Now, in our study and in reading Sri Aurobindo's commentary on these, we saw that these three powers are not really separate. In the Veda, all are aspects of the same one divine. It is the divine as Agni, divine as Vayu, divine as Indra. So it is the same divine impulse which was embedded within as the divine will, growing, emerging first as Agni and then becoming and representing as the power that is Vayu and then Indra. It is the journey of the soul through these stages, coming into self-awareness in a mental consciousness and then seeking to go further. Now all this is described in the parable not only as a cosmic working of evolution, but also individually within us. Not only as an eternal spanning time across eternity, but also as a crisis of evolution now. So here we are, the divine places comes before you, and suddenly you do not know what it is. And all the powers within you seek to realize, what is this? You see, innately in the human being, the moment something comes that we cannot understand, the instinct in us wants to reach out to know. A magician does an exercise of skill on the stage, and you say, how did you do? What is the secret? You always want to go behind to the thing itself. And so the divine challenges us at a series of stages in evolutionary development by appearing as something which is unknowable to the current development and drawing us out to the next stage of the development. The same idea is repeated in a completely different way in the different symbol, which is in the later part after the Vedic, in the Bhakti tradition with Sri Krishna as the Lord who is in form, who through a series of surprises, mischievous sometimes, interventions that break your current focus, distract you from your hypnosis in order to awaken you. Through a series of revelations, he leads you to discover him. By giving you a partial glimpse that moves you and is so attractive that you're willing to let go of everything else. And yet the glimpse was partial. You are not sure what it is. And you must chase after it in order to know and enjoy that delight, which is now tantalizingly glimpsed. And through a series of such glimpses, he takes you deeper and deeper into his world until you are completely cut off from your illusory living and are awakened to his divine living. And that's when he meets you bared, free of all your false trappings and coverings. It's the same idea, but in a very different image. The divine appears here before the gods every time they have a victory and they think, now we have conquered, now we have achieved a step fulfilled in evolution, and they are self-satisfied. Having claimed the victory as theirs, he appears to show their insufficiency and attracts them now to fulfill, to go further. So the same parable is describing a series of events, even as it describes the full movement of evolution. And for us now, individually, this parable takes on this form that the student of the Kena, having thus gone through this introspective process, having thus awakened in his deeper intuitive parts to the familiarity with the divine presence, he could stop there and say, well, mind cannot go further. I may receive what I can of that. Now it is no more unfamiliar and I'm close enough to it, and I stop. But this is precisely the point when you're on the verge of a greater realization. Your mind, Indra, has gone only so far as it can. When it seeks to know more, that vanishes. What mediates to lead further? because mind cannot go further, we have seen. And here comes the Divine Mother as Uma Haimavati, power of the divine consciousness, the creative power, energy of the divine, mother of the worlds. And she shows the mind who he is. And this, in the subjective yoga of the sadhaka, of the student, disciple of the Kena, Rishi, part 4 begins with, she said to him, Indra, that is our mind now, opening and ready, it is the eternal. Brahman. Sri Aurobindo translates as eternal here. It is the Brahman, the eternal. Of the Brahman is this victory in which you shall grow to greatness. And immediately the relationship changes. You see, the whole evolution has brought us to this point as far as the mind can go. If you have not come to this point, you are not ready for this step. But having come to this point, you are ready. The victory is not yours, it is of the eternal. And what are you then? You give yourself, open yourself. Then alone he came to know that this was the Brahman. In accepting that all that you are and all the powers within you which have led you to where you are his powers, his victory, his mind, his speech, his life, his senses. You give yourself to him because you are not. Then alone he came to know that this was the Brahman. Then it describes how of all the gods, beyond even Agni and Vayu, it is Indra because he came nearest to the touch of that. He first knew that it was Brahman. Now why this emphasis on first? He is greater than the others. Because in the whole of our being, the part most close to receiving and knowing the divine is the developed mind. And mind is not intellect only. Mind is the entire awareness of mind, including the heart's turn, including the turn of the will, including the essential aspiration in the way we are conscious of it. All of these are part of mind's refined and developed awareness. Possibly in the passage in the first 2 levels of training, sufficiently intuitivized that it can begin to feel and give itself directly. So this is the first to get in touch with that. Meaning, if Indra is the first, who's second? Vayu. Who's third? Agni. So the Kena Upanishad does not explicitly state all this, but by saying this is the first of the gods, the suggestion is all the other gods must follow after. So as your mind awakens and grows in closeness, your heart and your life begin also to awaken and grow in closeness. Your body and your life energies in the body also must turn and begin to grow in closeness, and all the rest follows, and all powers, secondary and tertiary, of the workings of the gods within you must also similarly turn and align themselves in the same movement which was begun in the deepest and highest part of your consciousness, in Indra. And after this, 2 more verses which we have studied the last few sessions prepare us for the final revelation, which will be in the last 4 verses. But these 2 verses now take us from this poise to the next level, the next depth of the experience. Now this is the indication of that. As is this flash of the lightning upon us, or as is this falling of the eyelid, so in that which is of the gods. And the next verse, then in that which is of the self, as the motion of the mind seems to attain to that, and bite afterwards, the will in the thought continually remembers it. Now these 2 verses, what they have done is, having brought us to this point, they lead us to the culmination of the transformation. So it's not enough that the gods have opened to the knowledge of that. In that knowledge, there is the merging, there is the pouring, There is the transfiguration of the gods. They undergo a change. Now keep in mind the earlier discussion. With every step in evolution, the gods grow in strength, a new power, a new capacity emerges. So in this poise, when the whole of evolution has come to this limit where Indra can know directly the divine, what happens in that first intermingling? Indra undergoes a change. All the gods begin to change now in terms of that, by this more complete identification in knowledge with that. And so the entire chapter which deals with this, Sri Aurobindo has titled The Transfiguration of the Gods. We are here. Yes, the transfiguration of the self and the gods. Now keep in mind, the Kena taught us to observe both internally and externally. So this transfiguration has a double movement. It is an internal shift. Our consciousness now becomes liberated in that joining with the divine, but our nature also must similarly, the gods joining with their source, our nature becomes liberated. And this is the double movement of the transformation. In the traditional yogic systems, what has remained is only the internal liberation, leaving behind and abandoning the outer, treating it as inferior, fallen, darkened, unchangeable, ignorant nature. But here the teaching is the gods themselves must awaken and be transformed. And nature herself transforms even as the inner consciousness awakens. And this double movement is characteristic of the original Vedic teaching as well as of the integral yoga, which Sri Aurobindo describes as the transformation of nature. The liberation of the soul and the transformation of nature. Both of these are captured in these two verses, but the process is described as a series of flashes, because it cannot happen all at once. And there's a process which Sri Aurobindo has described in great detail earlier. By a series of contacts, by a series of descents, the gods are habituated to now becoming familiar with the divine presence until that becomes a permanent poise. The remembrance becomes constant. The will in the thought continually remembers it. And the motion of this mind seems to attain to that, both internally in our consciousness and in our nature. When these two double movements begin to take place and they begin to join, the soul being liberated, nature being transformed, what happens in this double movement? What's the nature of the experience? The divine manifests more and more. Not only in your experience, but in the form of the experience, in your actions, in your thoughts, in your life forms and the life organization. Everything begins to reveal divinity more and more. And what is the first characteristic of the divine revelation? How do you know it is that? You see, growth of knowledge, one can still say, yes, it is growth of a capacity which was there. When somebody demonstrates power of intuition, which is already a level of knowledge above the intellect, our first response to it is, oh yeah, his mind is better trained, he is more intelligent, it is just an amplification of the current intellectual power. When the life energies begin to reveal something of the divine power, similar thing happens. Oh, he has great vitality, great power, great capacity. We only see it as an exaggeration of the existing trend. We do not, at least at first, recognize the inherent divinity in that new movement. What is there that you could recognize which would make the divine fundamentally differentiated? Something which has not so far been expressed by mind or life or matter. And so the next verse is telling you this. What is the name of that? It says, verse 6 of part 4. The name of that is that delight. As that delight one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. And this is literally the culmination of the teaching. After this, the next verse says, Thou hast said, speak to me, Upanishad. Spoken to thee is Upanishad. Of the eternal verily is the Upanishad that we have spoken. And the verse 8 and 9, two more verses, will tell you what it is, the knowledge that has been given to you. But the giving of the knowledge ends with this last verse. The name of that is that delight. As that delight one should follow after it. So he's teaching you now what you should do next in the journey. And the consequence of that will be, he who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. Now again, this is profound, both for our understanding as well as for the nature of the practice that it implies. And so we will now begin to explore what Sri Aurobindo has to say about it. But delight, recall, is something which is not existing in the current operations of Agni or Vayu or Indra. In the body, in the life, or in the mind, or in the senses. None of the four questions which led us to this greater awakening from what we were prepare us for, in themselves, for that delight. It is a fundamental aspect of the divinity which so far is not manifested in these four. At best, we may say, it is known to us in the very nature of the psychic being, which is the part of the divine already residing deep within us. So, when the name of that is that delight, it points to not only knowing the divine as it reveals and fills us with that power of delight from above, filling the powers of the gods, awakening them to the action of the Soma, the Satchidananda, the Ananda of the divine. It also suggests the emergence from within of this particular delight which the psychic being most closely within us characterizes. So as we read, we will keep this double aspect in mind. So coming to Sri Aurobindo's commentary, we saw that the realization must be here in life, and the goal is the eternal joy of the soul in the world of Brahman, in which it is one with the infinite existence, and yet in a sense still a soul able to enjoy differentiation in the oneness. It's interesting how closely this corresponds with our current study in the synthesis of yoga, where also this differentiation, the play of difference in oneness was the theme. And here it is the joy of the soul as it plays now this differentiation in oneness. This is where we had ended with the last description from Sri Aurobindo's commentary. And now he comes to this next verse. In the next verse, we have the culmination of the teaching of the Upanishad, the result of the great transcendence which it has been setting forth. And afterwards, the description of the immortality to which the souls of knowledge attain when they pass beyond the mortal status. So there are two things here. The result of this transfiguration of the gods and the transcendence of the consciousness. And then the description of what it is that the immortality one attains. It declares that Brahman is in its nature that delight, tad vanam. In Sanskrit, he explains here, vana is the Vedic word for delight or delightful. And tad vanam means therefore the transcendent delight, the all blissful ananda of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman from which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. Now, tad is that, vanam, delight. In pointing to that delight, it says, not this. This condition in which we live is one of strife, in ignorance, and we do not experience delight. We experience pain and pleasure, happiness and sorrow, and all the dualities, none of which are delight. The delight is something which can exist only in the transcendence of the two, of the dualities. So, even in consciousness, as long as you are in a consciousness that has to cycle through birth and death, you do not have delight. That consciousness which transcends birth and death knows the delight. That consciousness which transcends happiness and sorrow can know the delight. In other words, you break out of duality. You break out of all limitation. And here's the secret of the delight. You cannot experience delight as long as you are bound in a split, divided consciousness. Because a broken consciousness seeking to attain delight breaks it into happiness and sorrow. You can only know delight in a consciousness which can know oneness. And so you must be free of the compulsion of birth and death also. Death will not get you to the delight in an afterlife. You just have another variation of consciousness. Maybe a happier state, but you can also have a more miserable state. All the heavens and hells are also available to you in the vital states or in the mental worlds also. But they are both equally there. If you have one, you can have the other. And they follow each other generally. To be free of both gives you access to the delight. What part in us is free of birth and death? If you ask yourself, what is it that is common in state of birth and in transition of death and after death into next birth? What is the common thread? Is your psychic being. It is the one part in us which is essentially free of both and therefore capable of holding the delight. But the psychic being as it is now, still an evolving being, can only represent that delight in limitation. And it is unable to exercise or articulate the delight with full power in life. But what little it is able to contain and express is what reflects in our mind, first, as the delight of knowing. Every time we know something, we discover something, we realize something new, the joy. Always new knowledge is accompanied with this flash of delight. After a while it fades because the mind cannot contain the true nature of delight. And we need to know more and more. It's the delight also in the mind's aligning itself to truth as distinct from falsehood. Where you know this is false, where you know that is true. You speak the falsehood, maybe it was convenient. You seek the truth, maybe it was an inconvenient. Whatever the external circumstance which gives you joy, having spoken the truth gives you the joy. Having spoken the lie gives you a discomfort. Why? Because in the mind, the alignment with the psychic presence and its delight is in the turning to that which is aligned to the psychic, the truth, the beautiful, and the sacred. Satyam, truth, Shivam, the auspicious, Sundaram, the beautiful. These are the three forms in which the divine is expressed in the world of forms, and that these are the three things towards which the psychic leans and yearns, which are its nourishment for its growth. So whenever the mind aligns to these three, you have the reflection of the delight. When it misaligns, the mirror is out of alignment, it does not reflect the light, the mind becomes clouded and darkened. The same thing in our emotions. Whenever the heart turns towards the divine, towards the truth, towards the beautiful, towards the sacred, again the joy, the delight which comes. And the same even in our physical consciousness. When our actions are true and right and in alignment with the psychic inspiration, there is a deep satisfaction, indescribable, but there is in it a great strength, a great resilience. You're able to go through the most difficult passages of life because there is something which is inherently true, incorruptible within. And as long as you stay aligned to it, it's a fine alignment, a fine edge. As long as you stay aligned to it, you know, you have the certainty of crossing through and the realization. There is inherently in our whole being, the phrase Sri Aurobindo uses is the delight of existence. It is also underlying all existence in the cosmos, but in us individually we know simply to be is a delight. You cannot call it joy or sorrow. Those are all surface emotional transitory waves. There's an underlying essential delight of existence. That's why Sri Aurobindo says, in spite of the worst atrocities and worst impossible situations, most hopeless, we still do not give up. We still do not cut short the journey of life because it is a delight to be in spite of all these. And that is, even that experience is a reflection of the true nature of the immortality of Brahman, the Satchidananda. So, it declares that Brahman is in its nature that delight, tad vanam. And he explains the transcendent delight, capital D, the all blissful Ananda, capital A, of which the Taittiriya Upanishad speaks as the highest Brahman from which all existences are born. Now, this reference to the Taittiriya is important, and we will have to explore it in greater detail probably next time, because Sri Aurobindo never wastes words. If he bothers to give you a special reference, it is an indication for you, go and explore that for the elaboration. What he gives you here is the synopsis. You want the elaboration, you explore that. And Sri Aurobindo has taken great trouble to translate the Taittiriya Upanishad also. As an indication here, this is what it is. One of the problems of translation, we have seen before also, that many of these terms, especially those close to the Vedic, represented things which were essentially intuitive concepts. Over time, they have been mentalized and therefore reduced. And the mental interpretation itself has gone through changes at various phases. And the correct, Sri Aurobindo says, it is essential to recover the correct sense of the word, the correct etymology. Even the etymology that survives to us was formulated many thousand years after the Vedic age, when already the mind had begun to be, had taken on a very limited form. And so we may go back to those as reference at best superficially, but we need to go back to the true etymology. And so Sri Aurobindo spent a long time, a lot of effort in recreating and recasting the whole original etymology. I recall when we were students, we had been told that there are 40 notebooks of etymology where, taking root sounds, Sri Aurobindo has given out in detail the full elaboration of words which derive from these root sounds. Many articles which are already published in which this whole these examples have been given, but as far as I am aware, the full 40 notebooks are not yet published, but that is to be verified. But we have enough articles and enough examples of this etymology where he demonstrates how the words emerge from the root sounds and how the root idea, which is not a mental formed idea but an intuitive, multifaceted, experiential bundle which has an energy and a thought in it, That then becomes more distinctly formed with multiple facets as the root sounds begin to be elaborated with their variations and then their conjunctions with other sounds, making for a more mentalized concept or idea or thought. That whole process he has demonstrated, which then is also the basis of his secret of the Veda, his interpretation of the Veda, which is the only Vedic interpretation in human history that survives, in which every word of the Veda is consistent across the entire Vedic text. So far, all the commentators of the Veda had a certain word meaning something here and the same word meaning something elsewhere. And they had to do that because the true sense of the word was not formed and it had been understood more in reductionist mental terms. And so when you read Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Veda, it is an extraordinary revelation, but at the same time in reading, he lifts the mind to this intuitive poise and you begin to perceive, glimpse the way the rishis saw the verses. And that's what he's doing here also in his commentary on the Kena. So when he says the Taittiriya speaks of it as this, it's a pointer. Go and study that. But in sum, what does the Taittiriya say? The all blissful Ananda is the highest Brahman from which all existences are born, by which all existences live and increase, and into which all existences arrive in their passing out of death and birth. You can pass out of death, but that's not it. When you pass out of both death and birth, then you have it. Now here in this formulation, again there are suggestions, important. First, everything is born from that highest Brahman, which is the all blissful Ananda. You will recall Mother's comment about this when Paul Richard was arguing with Sri Aurobindo. He came from the more let's say Western esoteric schools, which go back to the Kabbalah generally, where the origin of the universe is in the will. The divine wills the universe into being. And Sri Aurobindo, from the Vedic perspective, said the divine manifests out of bliss. The universe is born from bliss as the first movement. And they had discussions around that. So the birth of the universe is from the all blissful highest Brahman. That continues not only to sustain, things live by it, but things increase by it. And here we will discover a great secret. The secret of accelerated evolution is precisely the delight. Everything in evolution moves forward by the nudge of delight and in the seeking of delight. And we will see how that delight is how the soul grows, the soul psychic being nourishes itself. And finally, into that delight we grow in our awakening as we transcend this limitation of ignorance and fragmented consciousness of birth and death. We awake to it and live in it, in the body and outside the body equally. So this we will take up for elaboration next time. For the moment we can simply read this last culmination of the Kena and meditate on it briefly. The name of that is that delight, Tadvanam. As that delight one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. And so this becomes the final culmination of the entire yogic process, to seek that as that delight, and in so following after it, we unite with all creation in his delight.